Well, hello. Welcome everybody to this month's consulting webinar. My name is Stephen Krutzfeldt, and I'm a pre-sales engineer here with CDI, and I'll be taking you through today's webinar. Just gonna get this PowerPoint queued up here. If this is your first build along, what is a build along? Well, in a nutshell, a build along is an interactive experience designed to guide the viewer through the creation and deployment of a common business process. Today's example is we're going to go through the creation and deployment of building out an expense reimbursement or expense submission form. We'll be using forms and workflow, and also we'll talk a little bit about how we can tie in SQL tables, get into some of those other ancillary components. If you have any questions, please post those into the chat box at the end of the webinar. I'll take some time to go through and answer as many of those as I can. To get the most out of this, take good notes, take screenshots even. I find the screenshots are super helpful. Don't be afraid to ask questions. If you have a question, chances are someone else is probably thinking the same thing, probably has the same question. Please complete the surveys afterwards also, especially now that we get toward the end of the year. I'm going to be looking for new, entertaining, exciting ideas of what I can present on, ideas that you guys may have, processes that you use in your organization. The survey will let me know what I'm doing right, areas I can improve, different ideas that we could bring to the table to present on. So we do take that seriously, and I do look over those. So more is always better. Also know that this is going to be recorded and individual sessions are available. We usually have these up on our YouTube channel if it's today's Thursday, hopefully by the end of the day tomorrow. If you do need access to that or have trouble finding it, just reach out to me personally, steven.krutzfeldt@citiesdigital.com, and I'll be more than happy to send you the link. So today's process is going to be around expense reports. Now, I said the intended audience for this webinar is going to be Laserfiche admins and advanced Laserfiche users. But the more I think about it, pretty much anybody can get some value out of this. Even though I'm going to be covering some advanced techniques and the creation and deployment of a forms process, there's a lot that goes into it that's more in those beginning stages also. Just learning how to create a form from scratch can be very beneficial. So I would say feel free to share this to others in your organization who may be just getting into forms or at least interested in learning more about it. My plan is to make this one a little bit longer and try and cover as much ground as possible. It's been a while since we've gone through a in-depth forms process, so why not make the most use of our time? You will need access, of course, to Laserfiche Forms today. So if you have that and have access to that, feel free to open that now. We'll also be using the Laserfiche client, i.e. the repository. We may get into the admin console a little bit, only to look at things like creating metadata templates and fields that could be used to move the approval process of expenses or identify which expense reports have been processed, which ones haven't, things like that. Another thing I didn't put on here that we'll at least be looking at is Sql Management Studio. So if you have any experience with SQL, or if you can get into SQL, I will at least be referencing that and talking a little bit about how to get those tables and actually query those tables from within a form and then also from within metadata and things like that. I'm hoping sometime in the next couple months to go through a little more in-depth webinar on how to tie in SQL tables and how to create a SQL table from scratch. Even though it's not necessarily a Laserfiche specific skill set, it's referenced all the time. It's used all the time. It's something that I found very beneficial in using Laserfiche every day. So I imagine that all of you could probably also benefit from that. So just know that that's on my radar and I'm hoping to bring it and put it on the horizon. So to help you follow along, an idea of what the agenda is going to look like, I'm going to start by going through an expense report demo. So I'm going to take you through the final product to see what it is that we're going to be building toward. We'll then go back, and if you're experienced with forms, you'll know there's two sides of that coin. The first one is the form creation, so creating the actual fields and what the form that's going to be submitted is going to look like. So we'll go through and we'll actually create that. And then we'll go through the business process, which is the other side of that coin. So once that form is submitted, where does it go? Is there an approval step? Is it going to be saved directly to Laserfiche? Are there workflows involved? That's where we'll kick into next. Now with that, I'm not going to bore you all day with PowerPoint, so let's go ahead and just jump into the demo. So I'm logged into Forms here, and you can see I have a list of my forms. I like to star the ones that I'm focusing on. That way they populate to the top. If you haven't used that in the past, just know that on your start process area, you can just click those stars and it will filter to the top. Otherwise, I think by default, they are just alphabetized. So to paint the picture for you, imagine that you are traveling to, I don't know, Empower maybe, although this year I think it's all going to be done online. It should still be very interesting. If you don't know what Empower is, reach out to us. We'd be more than happy to plug it and let you know what it's all about. It's a great time. Laserfiche user group, new product announcements, and a chance to interact with the community. But as you're traveling or as you're going to these different events, you're racking up different expenses that your company is going to pay for. So we want a way to be able to capture all that information. Where did the expense come from? Is there a receipt involved? Who is the individual, etc. All of that information. So we want to try and create a forms process where you can capture all that information in one place, include the images like the receipts, and then send that through a business process so that way it can go to the right person for approval and then also to accounting for processing. Now here I have a dropdown, and this is why I talk about SQL. We are actually querying a table right now, and I'm telling it to go ahead and look at all the different names of the people in our organization. Apparently I work for Dunder Mifflin today. And so we're going to choose Dwight Schrute. And as soon as I choose Dwight's name, it's automatically populating all that other information. And that's just one way that you can use this. It's not going to be required by any means. If you just want to have folks typing in their name and typing in their department or manager, whatever is relevant in your situation, that's fine too. But I did want to at least show that there is the capability to do that lookup and to automatically fill in these dynamic fields. Since I'm traveling to Empower for this, I'm going to go ahead and say this is a travel expense. Alternative could be office expense, and you'll notice that if I choose travel, that opens up another section and asks me to fill out some travel details. You can have as many or as few details here as you like, or you can choose to leave this out completely. We're going to say the travel start date is maybe on the 12th and ends on the 14th. Next down here, we have a section for the actual expense lines themselves. Now, I've seen this done a couple different ways. Some are just go ahead and put in the receipt and the total amount. Other times, I know it's important to itemize everything, that some will be eligible for repayment, some won't. So that's certainly something to think about also, that if you wanted to have a option over here that says is eligible to be paid out, then yes or no. You could also have specific items, but in this case, I'm more or less just saying that I incurred an expense on the 14th. The purpose was lodging. The vendor was, we'll say Marriott, amount for $250. And then I can upload a receipt. And I'm just going to select a digital copy from my desktop. Know also that if you are using Laserfiche Mobile, I don't know how many of you attended the webinar, I think it was like 2 weeks ago, but I went through and talked about the Laserfiche mobile app, which is really cool for stuff like this, especially with expense reports, because then if you have a stack of receipts for the day, you're at the end of the night, you want to fill this out, you can do all of that from your mobile phone, open up the forms process for expense reports, and just snap pictures from your mobile device of each one of those and make sure they're attached when they go through the process. So pretty slick. I think it's cool. But anyway, once we have everything done here, you know what? Let's go ahead and add another one just for fun. We'll say that on the 13th, we ate something. And we'll say that we just ate at, I don't know, Stella's. We'll add another receipt here. And the reason I did that is to show that down here, we have the total reimbursement requested option here. So $250 for the lodging, $200 for meals, and it's keeping a running total. Something else I've seen done in the past too is that you can start to put in some logic to say that how much of it needs to be paid out. So if this is equals yes to pay it out, and this one equals no, then it will only be $250 instead of $200. So know that there is some flexibility. So if you want to keep a running total of like, okay, this is what the total amount is, but this is the total amount to be reimbursed, those can be tracked separately, that you do have that option. So once this is all filled out, we'll go ahead and submit it. It'll spin for a second. And I have one step in here for approval, just to show that this can go through approval process first. I remember I had one job at one time where submitting expense reports was like pulling teeth. That you had to have the itemization just right. You had to have the code just right. That taxi cab was one thing, Uber was something completely different. Airline was one thing, and then airline baggage was something else. And so it got very finicky. Now, there's certainly ways that we can use the lookups of the tables to make things like that a little bit easier, a little bit more user-friendly. But the main point of bringing up the story is that it had to be sent back to me to make changes multiple times for every time I submitted an expense report. So if that is the case, know that that logic also exists in here as well, that once it goes in for approval, if they approve it, great, go ahead and send it on through, save it, send a notification, let somebody know that the next step's in place. But if not, send it back to the initiator to make the changes that are needed. And it looks like it is just taking its time right now. Just bear with me one moment. Go ahead and try refreshing this. Okay, well, instead, let's go ahead and go into the designer and see if that works instead. So if you're going to be creating this from scratch, the first thing that you need to do is go into the designer. You'll see here that you have the option to choose a blank process or a form submission, form approval, or you can upload. What's interesting about that is that once you have these saved, there is an actual physical file that can be shared to other forms users. So if you have something that you're using internally that you think is really helpful, feel free to share that with the rest of the community. Let them know that, hey, I've got this great expense report. So they can actually use that and upload it and then just tailor it to fit theirs. Also, if you're not familiar with the business process library, there are dozens of pre-built forms processes already in here. They're sorted by category, by industry. In fact, who knows, maybe there's even one in here for expense reports. But things like certificate generation, employee evaluation. Let's see what else is in here. Requests. If you haven't been through here, I encourage you to go in and just kind of poke around, see if there's anything that catches your eye, something that you might be able to use internally. The benefit and true value of this is that they do most of the work for you. You can just then drag and drop what you want to keep, what you don't want to keep, tailor it so it fits your own, like I said, your own organization. Now, I would say 99% of the time, I'm usually doing form submissions. The most of the time, I want to kick off these processes by filling out a form, hitting submit, and then sending that on down the path for either approval or something else. Form approval, I like to build it out and work it out logically, chronologically even. So rather than knowing that, yes, there's probably going to be an approval, it's just as quick for me to go ahead and drag and drop that next step rather than have it put in automatically. So I always choose form submission. And we're going to call this webinar expense. And we're even going to spell it right. Now, this is going to be our blank canvas. And remember, like I said, two sides of this coin, the process diagram and the form. For me, it makes more sense for me to create the form first rather than create the different steps. The main reason for that is going to be because you're going to have to reference a form. You can have multiple here, so for multiple different steps. Maybe if it goes down one path for approval, it needs a signature, and another path, it doesn't need a signature. You're going to need to make sure that you have two different variations of the form, one with a signature location, one without it, in order to do that. So under forms, you have your starting form. That's what we're going to select. Now, the first thing I always do here also, and this is, once again, personal preference. You're going to hear me say this a lot. I have a lot of preferences. I've built a lot of forms over the past couple of years, and so I have these, I don't know, little idiosyncrasies, things that I prefer. And one of them is where the label is located. This is just saying that when you have an actual field, like name or date or anything like that, the label is above it rather than to the side. I think the side just gets a little bit squished. It's kind of hard to read. So I always put it on the top. If later on you want to change this to landscape or portrait, depending on how it's beginning to look, this is also where you would go in and make those changes. So again, just as a reminder, that was the settings or the little cog. And I changed that to top. I always label it too. That's the first thing you see. So if you click on that, it'll open up the edit box. So you can select edit and just change your title. And we're gonna call ours, let's call it expenses. Now, if this is your first form, first of all, very exciting, congratulations. Second of all, it's all drag and drop. You have a list of the different types of fields that you can create over here on the left, and you just bring them over to where you want them to be. They'll open up in the some modification text here, so it lets you give it some additional information, one of them being a label. In this case, I'm going to say name. Seems like a good one to start with. We may even want to make it required, so we just check the box. If a field is required, that means that you will not be able to submit this form unless it is populated with some kind of value. It doesn't mean it's going to double check it or anything like that, but it does mean that something has to be in here. And you can limit the number of characters. If you don't limit it, then I don't think there is a limit. At least I haven't reached it yet. Just be aware that there's the ability to use barcode scans. We're not going to be looking at anything like that today, but it is something to just be knowledgeable of. The next thing I'm going to choose is some basic information about the employee. This is going to help further on down the process. If you start thinking about, all right, once this is submitted, who's it going to go to? Does it go to a specific manager? If it goes to accounting or payroll or anybody else for processing, what kind of information do they need to know? Do they need to know specific accounting codes? Do they need to know employee number? What kind of information do we need? So we can start bringing in things like, we'll add a number field. We'll just call it employee number. And again, these are just going to be examples. When you build this, it's going to be specific to your situation. Maybe we want to have something for position or manager. And a good reason to use employee manager is that once we create these fields, we can have dynamic routing so that if Stephen Krutzfeldt submits a expense report, I can have it go specifically to my manager. Whereas if another employee at CDI submits his or her expense reports, it can go to their manager. And so you can have maybe even a drop down of manager names. If you want to have a drop down, this is where we would select that. Drop down fields are very easy to create. In fact, with this one, we'll just say travel or office. And down here you have your choices. You just hit enter. I'm sorry, you just hit enter for each one of these, and then that'll create a new line. We can say other. You can have a default value if you want. I think we can leave it like this. If we want to put something above that, once again, just drag and drop where you want it to go. You will add employee email. So as you can see, it's starting to become a form. If you ever want to see what it looks like so far, and if it's starting to look and feel the way you want it to, you can always check that by going up to the preview button by clicking this eyeball. So it's kind of bland, but you can see here that you can start typing stuff in. One thing that's kind of nice too is if you are using the correct types of fields, so in this case, number, in this one, it's an email type of field. If you don't put in a correct email, it's going to turn red and yell at you that, no, you have to enter an email address. We know email address looks, what an email address looks like. Has an at and like a dot in there. So then once you have it formatted correctly, it'll recognize it. So we'll get out of our preview and look at a couple of other things. Now, one thing that's going to be really important, especially when you're creating expense reports, is understanding how to add different lines. So whether you're itemizing or you're just adding in different lines for specific receipts or what those expenses are, you're going to have what's known as a collection. So if we go down here, we'll see we have collection. If you click that, it'll automatically drop to the bottom. So we'll just call this expense items. You can give it some text above or text below. You can say like, please add line for each receipt. And done. So now everything within this collection is going to be its own item. Another option would be to use maybe a table if you want to set it up in table format, but I find that it's a lot more visually appealing if you just set it up this way. So some of the different items that we have would be like date incurred. So in here we would add date, call it expense date. You can also make those required. You can format so that way the date shows the time as well. Probably not necessary in this situation, but it is available. You can also format the date. So if you want to have year first, then month, then day, or something like that, you have options there as well. Another one that's going to be important would be, here, we'll go ahead and hit done first. Vendor. And amount would be a good one. And whenever I do amounts, I always use currency. So we'll drag a currency field over here. Actually like amount more than cost. And then if you want to have them upload something, you can go ahead and drag the file upload piece in here. And I usually just name this attachment or receipt. So now if we go to our preview, we can go in and we can see that we can type in our name, employee number, expense date is a date dropdown, vendor named, amount will automatically format to be a dollar amount, and then we can upload and it'll allow us to browse out just to our different local folders. You have the option to submit. So it's starting to come together, but what about some of those cool little tricks that I used before, like having a total that was calculated? Well, sure. First of all, we want our total to be in a currency. So let's go ahead and drag a currency over, maybe. All right, now they all happen all at once. Technology. So let's go ahead and delete a couple of these. And we'll call this currency total. Now calculating a total is a cool trick, and it's relatively easy to do if you know what you're doing. Each one of these has a basic tab and an advanced tab. The basic tab is going to have information like, is this read only? Is it required? What's the above and below text? And the advanced is going to have usually just formula, tooltip, and CSS class. CSS class, if you want to get into that, there's a YouTube video out there that I did several months back that shows how you can use CSS class and then also the CSS and JavaScript to really tailor your form and add a little extra outside of what's available just from the standard configurations here. So if you know someone who, or if you know JavaScript, HTML, CSS, you can apply all of those different tips and tricks to the form as well. We're not going to be using a CSS class today. Now, tooltip is simply going to be like a little question mark that shows up by the field that will give you a tip like, how do I use this? So you can say like, this field is the total of all the costs. But the formula is what we really want. And if you're at all familiar with Excel, you'll notice that a lot of these are very similar, and that's because they're virtually identical. And even the way that the formula is written out is pretty similar to how you would do it in SQL. So if we want a sum, it'll write equals sum, and then in here we're going to need to tell it sum of what? What do you want the sum of? You're like, well, we want it to be the sum of like all of the different amounts in this area. Well, it just so happens we have a token selector here. So you just put where you want that to be and go in here, and you should be able to select your variables, unless, of course, we haven't saved yet. So let's try something. Let's go ahead and go, first of all, to our themes, because I want to talk about that anyway. And it may give it a chance to cache everything that's been made already. If we go to themes, this is what's actually going to be the color and the aesthetic of the form that you're creating. There are a few that come out of the box. They're pretty terrible. For example, I would call this one like ketchup and mustard. Where was it? Yeah, so if you want it to have like a circus feel or kind of a, I don't know, almost a Wells Fargo from the 1950s, maybe you could do that. I kind of hate it. So I like to customize my own. The one that I've been working with has been CDI 2020. It pretty much matches all of our brands and things like that. So this way it looks just a little bit nicer. Now, if you want to customize that even further, you can go to the customize. And you have drop downs here. So you can add your image, add a logo based on your images. We just use the CDI one. We can change the background. I actually like to give it a little bit of texture. So that gray one's a good one. If you just want to make it completely garbage, you can make it plaid. I've never seen anybody use this one live. It is comical that it's available though, and it's like the second slot. The people at Laserfiche thought, oh, you know what people really want is more plaid. I don't think so. So I don't know, but the gray is pretty nice. It adds a little bit of texture. I think it adds a little something, makes the form pop. But once you have that, you can add it to your custom themes. And then you can use that, and so that way all of your forms can look and have sort of the same aesthetic. Let's go back to our layout and see if it's saved. So it's telling us that it contains a calculation error. Well, of course it does because we haven't finished setting it up. So sum equals, and now we should see there is all of our different fields. And you'll notice that expense items has a drop down, and there's currency and currency one. Well, we're gonna go with currency one because it sounds like it's the newest. Now, another thing that you need to be aware of is that it's not looking at the name of the field, it's looking at the field variable. And the variable can be found by opening it up and looking right here. So it looks like it's actually using amount with no number appended to it. So then what we'll actually want to do is go back in and edit this. Oh, is it because we have all these? But it does. Okay, so total should be sum and not currency, but actually expense items amount. And that's really all you need to do. So we'll say done. So then if we look at it, you'll see as we add that, it's now giving us a running total of all those different amounts. So just to refresh and go through that one more time, in total, go to edit, go to advanced, choose sum, or just write equals sum, and then inside parentheses, select the field that you want the sum of. In this case, it's expense items amount, and done. It'll automatically total those. So another trick I want to go into quick, you remember when I went through the demo, I showed that if it was a travel expense, we wanted to have travel dates, like a separate section open up. The way I did that was, first of all, I added a section. And I'll just go ahead and put it up here and call it additional section. And inside that, maybe we can say radio button, reimburse question mark, yes or no. And you can move those and so they're side by side if you want. So then another thing that we can do is, let's say we have a checkbox at the top. Say, does this need an additional section? And maybe we just want one choice. Just yes. So then what we can do is go into field rules. And the field rules are what's going to, now this is different from lookup rules. What field rules are saying that if you want to hide or show specific fields based on the actions and the choices made in the previous areas. So what we want to do is basically say we're going to show a specific section. I think it's just called additional section. I'll bet it hasn't cached yet. Yeah, it looks like it hasn't. Super slow stuff today. While we're looking at this, I'm just going to pull up the repository. Now I have mine that once they're submitted, we're just sending them to a specific finance, AP, expenses, and then pending location. So I kind of set up my folder structure so that way I can facilitate the different processes that are involved here. Now, of course, these can go pretty much anywhere. But this is where mine are going to go. And I have a specific template as well that I created just for today's demo. Expense reports, and it's just going to have the date, expense status of either pending or processed, and it'll capture the employee name from the form. So that's kind of what that could look like, and this can come in handy later to show if something's been processed or not, if you want the actual form, expenses, receipts, everything like that to be moved around. So let's go back to our form. Let's try this new field rule. So field rules are kind of cool. In this case, I want to show, which means basically it would probably be hidden otherwise. And I want to show my additional section when does this need additional section? Yes is checked and saved. And it's as easy as that. So then if we look at this, we can say, does this need an additional section? Yes. And then it's going to open up everything else and all that information. So then you can start adding your dates and everything else. Now, lookup rules are a little bit more advanced. How am I doing on time? Got some time. But I did say that I was going to go through and cover this. So while I'm thinking about it, let's just pop into this. So number one, if you're not familiar with this little icon here, that's Sql Management Studio. When I work in SQL and I'm doing lookups to additional SQL tables, the first thing I do is create a brand new database so that way I know I'm not going to be tripping over or treading on anything else that is important, anything else that is running all of my background tasks. I don't want to disrupt the SQL table at all or any of the SQL tables, but I do want to create a situation where I can look up my own data. So I would recommend having a little bit of background in SQL before you just pop in here and start messing around, or at least involve somebody else who does. But if you're already familiar, then I would tell you the first thing I would do is log in and create a new database by just right-click, new database. With every client I've ever worked for, whenever I create a new database, I always just call it LF external tables. That way I'm consistent. I know exactly which database, what it's going to be called every time, and then I create my tables in there. So that way I'm not stepping on LF Business or LF Financial, which are my different repositories. I'm not in any sort of conflict with any of the Laserfiche pieces, and I can just maintain everything from here. Now, my go-to table, I started by creating it in Excel, and then I just copied and pasted it in here. And my favorite one is going to be Office. I also have an Office Lite with a little bit less information, but you saw me referencing Dwight Schrute, and he works in sales, and he's the assistant to the regional manager. Well, the way I did that was I designed it, first of all, with these different columns. So I've got first name, last name, department, position, hire date, supervisor. All this information was created. Data type, I usually just use varchar. I find that number is fine, or integer is fine. Always use an integer when you're doing the ID. But I find that varchar 50 to 100 or 250 usually is sufficient for everything that I need. So name of the column, varchar, and then however many characters, usually 50. Again, I'll try and go into this in a little bit more detail in one of the other webinars, but for today, just know that that's what we're referencing. If we want to see what the table actually looks like, we can right click and go to select top 1000 rows, and you can see what's actually happening on the table, what that looks like. So I have Michael Scott, management, regional manager. He was hired on this date. His supervisor is David Wallace. He has a phone number, he has an email, he has an address, city, state, zip, position number, hourly rate, accounting code. This is my play table that I use to try and show the rest of these things. I'm actually proud of it. That's the only reason we're looking at it, is just to fuel my ego at this point. But no, I really enjoy using this thing, and I reference it quite a bit. It's good to have something like this. But so when I'm pulling in data from SQL, this is the table that it's reading. And the way to tell it that is if we go back to this, we can use the lookup rules. Actually, first things first, though, I'll show you how to do this. If we go to Forms, which is just, this will say whoever you're logged in as. I'm logged in as a user named Forms. But if we go to Administration, and then if we go to Data Sources, you'll see here I have my external tables. Now, if you wanted to add a new data source, or if you wanted to point it to an external table, you can call it SQL. You would tell it that it's a Microsoft SQL server if you're using SQL. You would need to know the server name, the database, which is always LF external tables. And you would have to have the username and password for that table as well. Now mine's already set up, and it looks like this. And so Microsoft SQL Server, localhost, Laserfiche of external tables, username SA. Now, once you have that table registered in Forms, then you can start tying it to some of your other Forms processes. In this case, you can see all of these different Forms processes that are already looking at it. If I want to add or remove a process, I would go up here and say add. And I should have a new one in here. What do we call it? Webinar? Yeah, webinar expense. So save. So once we say that this form is allowed to look up and use this table, then it should be available. So we go back into our design. Go back to our, I'm sorry, you know what? Let's do this. To manage. Webinar expense. Go to our starting form. And then lookup rules. So with lookup rules, we basically are going to say that, well, first of all, our data source. We only have one. It's called external tables. We need to choose which of the external tables. So it's looking up to that database, and that database has several tables that I've used over the past couple of years. Specifically, we're using my Office one. We can sort by whatever, but actually, let's just leave it. And now we just say which of our fields. Now we can say when something matches a certain other column, that's when we want to populate it. But for the first one, I usually do this. I just take out that top and just say, that's basically saying always. So always fill employee name, there it is, name, with employee name, and save. So then what you can do is start adding your conditions, because that's going to be your lookup, right? That's the query. So we're basically querying employee name, and once you find that row, you can populate additional information. So what I could do then is say, once again, we want to have the same external table database. We want to use the Office one. And we want to say that when this is true, so when name matches employee name, so when this is true, that's our lookup, that's when we want to fill employee number with, I think I have an employee number, position number. Sure, position number, that'll be just fine. So then what you can do also is if you go to the layout, you can now say that position number, or employee number rather, this is being populated automatically, it can become read-only. So now we have a pretty respectable looking form here. We have a drop-down now that can allow us to select from all these different names. And you'll see that her employee number is in automatically and it's read-only and I can't change anything. But that's how we would then also auto-populate employee manager, employee email, and things like that. So once our form is good to go, we can start with the process diagram. I'm going to move kind of quickly here, unless the system tells me I can't. So first thing I always do is delete that line. You will have to have a start and an end, and the two have to be connected for this to be valid and to actually work. But now you have to, I like to whiteboard this usually. So I literally draw it out on a whiteboard of where it's going to go. In my case, it would be like, okay, well, once it's submitted, it needs to go to the manager for approval. Once the manager has approved it, then it needs to be saved in Laserfiche, and we need to send out a notification to accounting, or maybe not even send a notification, just send it to a place where, you know, every week AP or accounting or payroll, whoever does the processing for that, can find those and see which ones haven't been processed yet. So that's what that would look like. So essentially, we would first have a user task where it submits to a person, and then if they approve it, it goes to Laserfiche. And then that would basically be the end of this process. So you start connecting them. Go to a person, go to Laserfiche, and then that's the end of it. The 3 lines is the save to Laserfiche, and the little person is move to a person. The other 2 options we have down here are the little gear. That basically means kick off a workflow. So if you have a workflow that's looking or you want to run, excuse me, at a certain time, you could say, once you move it here, run this workflow or run this business process. And the other one is send email notification. However, also know though, when you configure these, you can email the user when it's been assigned to them, if that's an option. And so then you configure and write out what the email would look like. However, let's go in order. Start. So you can double click on that. It'll open up the dialog box over here. You can call this expense form submission. You would then need to choose your starting form. In this case, we only have one, and I didn't rename it. Know also that you can enable Recaptcha. So if you want to make sure that robots aren't submitting your forms, could be a problem. You can enable that. Also, you have the option to collect payments. I believe the 2 vendors that it has standard integration with is Authorize.net and blanking on the other one right now, sorry. But Authorize.net is the most common. Just know that if you want to collect payment on this form, that is a possibility. Also, making these forms public is another option that you have. But basically, we're saying that the submit button is going to be submit, and once that button is hit, that's when it's going to send this message and go on to the next task. In this case, we want to say manager approval. And you can go to a team. You can go to a team based on a variable. So if you have like a team called managers or something like that, you can go to them, and the variable could be something like, if it's over a certain threshold or a certain amount, if it's over $1,000, it needs to go to the director first. Otherwise, in this case, I'm just sending it to a specific user. I can send it to Steven, or I can send it to a different role. So if I want to send it to the initiator, for test purposes, I always recommend putting initiator in this. That means that whoever submits the form can go through and do all the approvals and everything. That way you can test it end to end. Then you can retroactively go back and then assign who you're actually going to be sending it to. Now, the next piece, you can actually change or add different conditions to these lines as well. So if we want to say only go down this line if approval has been approved, we would say that last user action equals, well, in this case, we want to approve. So here we would also have to say that on the form, so select this, go to form, we have approve and reject. Save. So then we can say only go down this line if the last user action equals approve, insert, and save. Now the problem is what happens if we hit reject? Has no place to go. So we have to add a branch. And the way I would do that is bring in this conditional, exclusive gateway. There's exclusive gateways, inclusive gateways, and parallel. Inclusive means it can go down multiple. Parallel means it goes down all of them at once. Exclusive, it only goes down one. So what we would actually want to do, if we were doing this right, let's bring this over here a little bit more so we have a little more real estate. And say either go to this exclusive gateway, and then if it's approved, go to Laserfiche, and if it's rejected, go back to the initiator. And so then once the initiator makes their changes, we can have it go back to the individual, or sorry, back to the manager for approval again. If not, then it'll go in the circle like my old job used to do. And the last piece here would be save to Laserfiche. Losing my voice. You'll just need to pick a profile. So that would be which Laserfiche server you're going to be using, which repository are you selecting, and then you'll need a username and password for that. Once done there, you can select where it's going to save. Now, because we're short on time, I'm going to go back into my inbox and approve the one that I created earlier. Hopefully. And if this doesn't load, then I'm going to do something else. Unreal. Okay. So approval by supervisor. So this is what this approval step would look like. You'll see along the right-hand side, there is a history of the steps it's gone through already. So if this has multiple steps, you'll see that when it was submitted, when it was approved, and so on and so forth. Then go through and view all the information, open up the attachments with different invoices. If it looks good, sign it, say great, and approve the request. Now, the reason I wanted to show this is because I'm sending it directly to Laserfiche to a specific location. You'll see here that actually, let me see something. Yep, there it was. So what you saw was everything coming in at once, but then merging into one document. Now, this is something that we do internally that our consultants can help you with, but there is the capability to create a workflow that takes the form submission and then all of the invoices and merges them into one document. That oftentimes, I mean, originally, an expense report comes in, you have the form, Then you've got the receipts, and they're kind of hard to keep track of. You could always make sure that they're all kind of associated with one another, that you could use links. But what I find is better is why not just have it all be one document? So here's all of your invoices in one document. On top of that, you also have the original form submission, and you'll also have the action history. So it was submitted on this day. It was approved by this person at this time. And also, by the way, here's the form that was submitted. And so we have name of the employee, employee number, what was regarding, and everything else all in one place. So if all this looks good, you can just go ahead and say, all right, we filled it out, it's processed, save it, looks great, and close. And then once processed, it'll leave and go into the process location. So to summarize, we can create a form, an expense report. We would then use the process diagram to say where it's going to go based on the different approvals or variables. Once saved to Laserfiche, we can create a workflow that will merge it all into one document. And then once processed, we can have another workflow move it depending on what the status of that field is. Now, I know I've been talking for an hour and I still didn't cover a lot of the nitty-gritty details. Usually when we do these things, it's like a 4-hour seminar going through all these things. It takes months to really master, but I encourage every one of you to start playing around with forms a little bit, get familiar with just look and feel, some of the different tips, tricks, and things that we talked about, how you can use those when building a form, and just see how far you can get. And then if you need help, there's so much information out there. In fact, it's a good segue. Let's revisit the PowerPoint. Answers.laserfiche.com, also known as Google a Laserfiche question and click on the top answer because it just takes you to answers. Every question you have, somebody else has already asked it and it's been answered on Laserfiche Answers. It's an amazing resource. Also, the Solution Exchange, that's another place where you can just kind of dig through, and if you want some light reading material on things that Laserfiche can do, that's a good one. And then also their support site has a lot of white papers, what's new, what's been released, what it can't do, things like that. So that's another good one. What's not listed on here is the CDI emails, Stephen.Krutzfeldt@cdi.support or Stephen.Krutzfeldt@citiesdigital.com. Reach out to me personally. I love talking about this stuff. I basically eat, sleep, live, breathe Laserfiche now. So anytime when I can, impart some of that knowledge and some of that experience, I'd be more than happy to do that. But I hope that you found this beneficial. I hope you found this valuable. I hope you took something away from it. I've been wanting to go into more details on some of these anyway. The slides are pretty short, so I wanted to cover a little more ground than normal. To those of you watching this on YouTube, thanks for finding me. Hit like and subscribe. I think that's what you say, right? With that, I know we're getting close to time, but I want to go ahead and open it up for a couple of questions before we let you all go. All right, so don't understand why a theme had to be applied prior to being able to finish some formula. Basically what it did is, for whatever reason, on the design tab, there's no save button. But if you go to the field rules or to the theme or somewhere else, you navigate away from it, it automatically saves and caches your changes. Again, I don't know why there's no save button on the designer tool, but the reason I did that is basically just a quick workaround. I could have just as easily gone one tab over and then hit the save button on that tab, but I knew we wanted to cover the themes piece anyway, so I'm like, well, might as well do that, and it'll two birds with one stone. It's going to save my work, and it's going to allow me to show the theme. So ultimately, it's just a trick to hitting save on an area where there is no save button. Our SQL database is the only type of data source that can be used. No, you can also use ODBC. You can also use, I mean, those are the only two I've ever used, I guess. No, I take that back. I've seen Access used also, although now I think about it, Access may have been used using ODBC connectors drivers. So ODBC and SQL are the two big ones and also the easiest in my opinion. But if you're asking, can you maybe hook it up or use a lookup to like an ERP system or a CRM or something like that? Possibly. Yeah, it's very possible that that exists. Although I will say with most of my clients that are using CRMs and need to have a lookup, uh, it's very difficult to do a direct lookup to something like Salesforce. So what we do instead is we run nightly queries and we use workflow to basically go into Salesforce, grab the type of information and data that we want, and then save that to a SQL database, and then just use the lookup from forms to SQL. I realize that was long-winded, but ultimately, Salesforce data writes to SQL, then forms reads SQL. And so through separation is looking up CRM specific information and data. Good questions. Thank you, Benjamin. Anything else before we jump here? I know we are just a little bit over our time now. If there's nothing else, thank you guys so much for hanging out with me for the past hour. I hope you found it helpful. Know also that this will be posted to our YouTube channel, hopefully by the end of day tomorrow. Feel free to reach out to us directly if you want to learn any more. If you have any questions, we're always available to help. We got a whole staff ready, willing, and able to work with you on this. Thanks again, everybody, for joining. Have a good rest of your week, and we'll see you next month.